I have spent more than half a century walking among men who possessed fortunes that could rebuild nations, and among men who could not afford a decent meal. I have sat at the mahogany desk of Andrew Carnegie, who handed me the key to a study that lasted 20 years. I have stood in the workshop of Thomas Edison, in the quiet presence of Henry Ford, and in the austere offices of John D. Rockefeller. And I can tell you, after all these years of observation, that the difference between the man who lives in abundance and the man who lives in scarcity is not found in his bank account, nor in his lineage, nor in the accident of his birth. The difference is written in the hidden chambers of his own mind. Let me begin with a paradox that took me nearly 3 decades to fully understand. The poorest man I ever met in Pittsburgh in the winter of 1909 had $47 in his pocket. The wealthiest man I ever met, in terms of inner possession, had less than 2. The first man trembled because he believed the world was a thief waiting to take what little he had. The second smiled because he believed the universe was a river and he had learned how to stand where it flows widest. That single difference in belief, invisible and weightless, determined the entire trajectory of their lives, and it will determine yours. Scarcity is not a condition of the world. Scarcity is a condition of the mind. I want you to hear that sentence again, because everything I am about to share with you rests upon it. The man who believes there is not enough will always find evidence to confirm his belief, because the subconscious mind is the most obedient servant ever created. It brings him exactly what he expects, wrapped in the precise circumstances he feared. He will call it bad luck. He will call it the economy. He will call it the fault of other men. He will never, and this is the tragedy, look into the mirror of his own thought and recognize the architect of his own suffering. I learned this lesson first from a boy who sold newspapers on the corner of Fifth Avenue. He had worked that corner for 7 years, and each year he earned slightly less than the year before. Across the street stood another boy, no older, no stronger, who had been there only 11 months. That second boy was saving money, expanding his route, and already employing 2 younger children to assist him. The first boy spoke, whenever a customer passed, of the hardness of the times, the greed of the publishers, the impossibility of getting ahead. The second boy spoke of tomorrow's headlines with the enthusiasm of a man announcing a coronation. Same corner, same papers. 2 entirely different universes, because 2 entirely different minds. This is what Carnegie wanted me to understand when he commissioned my study of the 500 most successful men of our age. He did not want me to catalog their fortunes. He wanted me to excavate their minds. What I discovered after 20 years of listening is that every one of them, without exception, had crossed an invisible threshold. They had ceased to think like men waiting for permission and begun to think like men who had already received it. They had moved from what I came to call poverty consciousness into prosperity consciousness. That migration is the most important journey a human being can ever undertake. But here is where most men misunderstand me. Prosperity consciousness is not the cheap optimism of the market square. It is not the practice of standing before a mirror and telling yourself pretty lies while your bills pile upon the table. I have seen thousands of men attempt that cheap magic, and I have watched it fail them every time, because the subconscious mind cannot be bribed by empty words. The subconscious responds only to the deep, emotionalized conviction that enters the soil of belief. You may repeat 1,000 affirmations a day, but if beneath them you secretly believe yourself unworthy, it is the unworthiness that will flower. What Hill discovered in the long, quiet hours of his research was deeply unsettling. He discovered that the overwhelming majority of men carry within them a silent contract with scarcity. They signed it as children, often without knowing. They signed it when they heard their father say that money was the root of evil. They signed it when their mother wept over unpaid accounts. They signed it when a school teacher informed them that dreams were for the reckless. Every day of their adult life, they honor that contract. They work to fulfill the small expectation that was pressed into them before they could defend themselves, and they call this fate. I tell you plainly, it is not fate. It is a contract, and every contract can be rewritten. I once spent a long evening with a man who had lost 3 businesses in a row. He came to me broken, convinced the world had been arranged against him. He believed himself cursed. I asked him a single question. What did your grandfather say about rich men? He paused. His eyes grew distant, as though traveling across 30 years in a single breath. Then he repeated a phrase he had not thought of since he was 9 years old. Rich men, his grandfather had said, always lose it in the end. That single sentence, uttered beside a fire in the hills of Kentucky, had ruled this man's life for 4 decades. Every time he had approached success, his subconscious had obeyed the inherited law. It had arranged for him to lose it in the end, because in the end, losing it was what rich men did. This is the darkest game the subconscious mind plays with the unsuspecting soul. It enforces, with ruthless precision, the beliefs it was given before we had the power to choose them. Most men never examine those beliefs. They live inside them the way a fish lives inside water, unable to recognize the medium of their existence. You, however, are different. You are listening to these words tonight for a reason. Some part of you has already begun to suspect that your limitations were installed, not inherited. That suspicion, fragile as it may feel, is the beginning of your liberation. Hold it, protect it, feed it. Now let me speak of abundance, not as a slogan, but as a law. The universe in which we move is, by every measurable standard, extravagantly abundant. The stars number beyond counting. The grains of sand upon a single beach would confound the finest mathematician. There is no scarcity in nature. Nature does not know the word. Nature produces 10,000 seeds where one would suffice, because nature understands what the frightened human mind forgets, that life, in its truest essence, is overflow. Life is surplus. Life is the river that cannot be contained by its own banks. The question, then, is why we feel so poor in the midst of such richness. The answer lies in a single principle I came to call the law of transmutation. The abundance of the universe does not pour into the vessel of your life by accident. It pours only where there is a vessel prepared to receive it, and the vessel is your mind. If your mind is shaped like fear, the universe pours fear into you, and fear multiplies. If your mind is shaped like lack, the universe pours lack into you, and lack multiplies. If your mind is shaped like faith, the deep, emotionalized faith that Edison carried when he failed 10,000 times before the electric lamp was born, then the universe pours opportunity into you, and opportunity multiplies. The law does not play favorites. It simply responds. But the real turning point begins here, in the recognition of a detail most people overlook. The vessel of the mind is not shaped by what you think occasionally. It is shaped by what you think habitually. A man may spend 5 minutes a day in faith and 23 hours and 55 minutes in fear, and then wonder why his life has not changed. The subconscious is not impressed by visits. It is impressed by residence. You must move into the house of abundance. You must unpack your belongings there. Only then does the law begin to work with you, because only then have you given it something consistent to respond to. I remember a young man who came to me in the spring of 1927. He was a door-to-door salesman, earning barely enough to keep a roof over his family. He asked me with the desperation of a drowning man how to apply the principle of abundance to his circumstances. I told him to do something strange. I told him to walk every morning before dawn through the wealthiest neighborhood of his city, not to envy, not to compare, but to observe, to imagine himself vividly as a man who belonged there. 6 months later, he wrote to me. He had tripled his income. A year later, he had purchased a house on one of those very streets. He told me that something inside him had changed. He had ceased to be a man who observed wealth from a distance and become a man who moved within it. The outer world rearranged itself to match his inner residence. This is not mystical nonsense. This is observable psychology. This is the mechanics of the human mind working as it has always worked, in every age, in every culture. The Stoics of ancient Rome knew it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man's life is what his thoughts make of it. Emerson declared that a man becomes what he thinks about all day long. The sages of the East knew it and built their entire practice upon the disciplined governance of inner attention. What Hill contributed was not the discovery of a new law. Hill translated an ancient law into the language of practical achievement, so that the carpenter and the clerk could apply it with the same precision the mystic had always reserved for the monastery. Let us now turn the mirror toward our own age, because the spirit of our time carries peculiar diseases that earlier generations did not face. The modern individual lives inside a storm of images designed to make him feel poor. Every screen he touches whispers that he does not have enough, that he is not enough, that someone else is living the life he should be living. This is not an accident. This is an industry. There are men whose fortunes depend entirely upon keeping you convinced of your insufficiency, because a satisfied man is a poor customer. The first task of anyone who wishes to live in abundance today is to recognize this warfare and build defenses against it. I have watched, with a kind of quiet grief, how the modern mind has lost its compass. Men scroll through the lives of strangers and conclude that their own lives are inadequate. Children are raised on a diet of constant comparison, and they grow into adults who have never known the simple dignity of contentment with what they have built. The modern man searches outside for opportunity, while he loses the war within his own mind. The universe continues to pour its abundance into the vessels that are prepared to receive it, but his vessel is cracked because he has never stopped to repair the cracks. What Hill said about this subject, had he lived to see our time, would have been deeply unsettling. He would have told us that we have built a civilization of the permanently distracted, and that the first enemy of abundance is distraction. A man cannot hold a definite major purpose while his attention is fragmented 1,000 times a day. The cultivation of abundance consciousness in our age requires the reclamation of attention. You must become the sovereign of your own gaze before you can become the architect of your own destiny. Now, I want to speak with you about something practical, because philosophy without application is merely entertainment for the idle mind. There are concrete movements of the soul that shift a man from scarcity into abundance. The first is the practice of autosuggestion, but practiced correctly, not as cheap repetition, but as the deliberate impression of deeply felt belief upon the subconscious. Each morning, before the world begins its assault upon your attention, sit in silence. Speak to yourself with emotion the truth of who you are becoming. Speak it as though it were already accomplished, because in the domain of the subconscious, the future and the present are the same country. The second movement is the formation of a mastermind. No man has ever risen to genuine abundance alone. Carnegie had his circle, Ford had his, Edison had his. Every great achiever in my study was surrounded by a small group of minds aligned with his purpose, meeting regularly, thinking together, lifting one another above the common plane. If you find yourself in a circle of men who complain, who fear, who speak always of what cannot be done, understand this clearly. Your environment is painting your mind whether you consent or not. You must either change the circle or change yourself out of it. There is no third option. The third movement, and perhaps the most subtle, is the cultivation of gratitude, not as a sentiment, but as a discipline. Gratitude is the recognition that abundance has already begun. The man who waits for abundance to arrive in its fullness before he gives thanks will never see it arrive at all, because the law of increase responds only to the acknowledgement of what is already present. The fastest way to double what you possess is to become deeply, fiercely, unreasonably grateful for what you already hold. It sounds simple. It is not. It is a discipline that must be practiced daily until the mind itself has been retrained to see what it had been trained to overlook. And now we arrive at the paradox at the heart of this entire teaching. You cannot pursue abundance directly. The moment you pursue it with desperation, you have confirmed your scarcity, and the law responds accordingly. Abundance comes to the man who has found within himself a quality of inner wealth that exists independently of his outer circumstances. He walks as though he already possesses what he seeks. He breathes as though nothing is missing. He serves others without the small calculation of what he will receive in return. And precisely because he has released his grip upon the thing he desires, the thing is finally free to find him. This is the great secret the frightened mind cannot comprehend. The frightened mind believes it must clutch the coin tightly, or it will be lost. The abundant mind understands that the clutched coin produces nothing, while the coin released into circulation returns multiplied. Every great fortune in my study was built upon this principle, though few of its architects could articulate it. They gave freely. They served generously. They trusted that the river would continue to flow. The man who hoards against the fear of lack creates the lack he hoards against. The man who circulates in faith of abundance creates the abundance he circulates within. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because in it is hidden the answer to why so many well-intentioned seekers remain poor. They have studied the literature of success. They have memorized the affirmations. They have attended the seminars, but they have not yet released the tight fist of fear. They are still, somewhere beneath their conscious striving, operating under the conviction that if they let go, they will fall. The universe, which responds to the deepest belief rather than the loudest declaration, continues to arrange circumstances that confirm their secret conviction. The work is not to try harder. The work is to believe differently, at a level so deep that the trying is no longer necessary. Let me tell you of a man I knew in his 70th year, a man who had built and lost 3 fortunes in his lifetime. Most men would have considered him a tragic figure. He considered himself the most fortunate man alive. I asked him once how he could speak with such lightness of 3 lost fortunes. He laughed and said something I have never forgotten. "Napoleon," he said, "a fortune I could lose 3 times was never really a fortune. The true fortune is what grew in me during the losing. That no one can take." He died a year later in a modest house, surrounded by men who loved him. I have never met a wealthier soul. He had understood that abundance is not a quantity. Abundance is a quality of being. In the darkest corner of your failures waits the light you most fear to face. That light is the recognition that you have always been responsible, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of authorship. The life you have constructed is the life your mind has been dreaming, whether you dreamed it deliberately or accidentally. This recognition, when it arrives, is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it removes every excuse. Liberating because it returns to you the pen with which your story is being written. From this moment forward, if you accept the pen, you are no longer the victim of your circumstances. You are the quiet author of what comes next. I have observed something strange in men who make this crossing from scarcity into abundance. They do not, as one might expect, begin to acquire possessions frantically. Quite the opposite. They often simplify. They release what is not essential. They discover that much of what they had pursued was the pursuit itself, the anesthesia of striving. And once the underlying lack was healed, the striving lost its grip. They begin to live from a center rather than from a deficit. They begin to choose rather than to chase. And this, paradoxically, is when the outer world begins to offer them more than it ever did when they were chasing it. Now, I wish to speak of fear, because no discussion of scarcity is complete without an examination of the fear of poverty, chief among the 6 great ghosts. It does not walk openly. It dresses itself in reasonableness. It speaks in the voice of prudence, of caution, of common sense. And it paralyzes more men than any other force I have encountered. You must look this ghost in the eye. You must trace it back to the moment it entered your house, and you must escort it to the door. Most men never do. They live with the ghost as a permanent tenant, and they wonder why abundance always seems to pass by their window without stopping. Here begins the real work, and I warn you, it is not comfortable. You must sit with yourself in the quiet hour and ask what you truly believe about money, about worth, about deserving. Not what you say you believe, not what you were taught to believe, what you believe in the small, honest moments when no one is listening. Many men will find in that interrogation that they believe themselves unworthy of great prosperity. They believe it would corrupt them or isolate them or confirm some judgment they have feared since childhood. Until these subterranean beliefs are brought into the light, they will continue to govern the man from below. That is the descent every seeker must make before the ascent becomes real. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is this: they did not achieve because they were different at birth. They achieved because at some definite moment they rewrote the inner contract. They decided that the old story was finished. They declared, often without ceremony, that they were now the authors of a new chapter. The universe, which had been waiting for that declaration, responded with the materials necessary to build the new edifice. You, too, stand before such a moment. You have stood before it 1,000 times and walked past it. Tonight, perhaps, you will not walk past. Abundance, in the end, is not about money. I must say this clearly, because many who come to these teachings are still thinking only of dollars. Money is merely one expression of the abundant principle. A man may be financially wealthy and spiritually impoverished. Another may have modest means and yet live in a state of overflowing richness, surrounded by love, by meaningful work, by a quality of presence no amount of money could purchase. The true pursuit is the pursuit of the abundant mind, because from that mind, every form of wealth becomes accessible. I watched Carnegie give away hundreds of millions of dollars in his later years. He built libraries across the land because he understood something that escaped most of his contemporaries. He understood that wealth, held too tightly, becomes a prison for the soul. He understood that circulation is the law of life, and that the only way to remain truly wealthy is to remain in motion with the river. The great philanthropists I studied gave not out of duty, but out of recognition. They recognized that the source was infinite, and that their role was to serve as a channel, not as a reservoir. And so, as our time together draws toward its close, I want to leave you with a question that will not release you easily. When was the last time you truly examined your inner contract with abundance? Not yesterday, not last week. The real examination, the honest descent into the chambers where your unexamined beliefs still govern you. If you cannot remember, then the examination has not yet occurred. It is waiting for you. Every day you postpone it is a day you continue to live inside the old story. And the old story is not yours. The old story was given to you. The new story is the one you must write. And it can begin, truly begin, only in the silence where you finally meet yourself without disguise. I have given you in this hour the distillation of decades. I have told you that scarcity is a condition of the mind, not the world. I have told you that abundance is a law, not a luck. I have told you of the mastermind, of auto-suggestion rightly practiced, of gratitude as discipline, of the paradox of the released grip, of the ghosts that must be escorted to the door. I cannot walk this path for you. No man can walk it for another. But I can promise you that the path is real, and that those who walk it reach destinations the frightened mind cannot even imagine from its current vantage. So I leave you with this. Tonight, before you sleep, sit for a few minutes in stillness. Ask yourself, with gentleness but without evasion, what story you have been living. Ask whether it is your story or a story you inherited. Ask whether you are ready now to lay down the inherited story and take up the pen. The door is open, and it has always been open, and it will remain open for exactly as long as you are willing to walk through it. When was the last time you truly listened to the voice of your own inner abundance, the voice that has been waiting patiently beneath all the noise of your fear to tell you who you have always been meant to become? That voice is speaking even now. The only question that remains is whether at last you will answer.